Welcome to the West African Competitiveness Observatory. This is the third of a series of videos exploring the Trade Competitiveness module. The West African Competitiveness Observatory monitors trade competitiveness, looking at both its drivers and performance indicators. The drivers, which shape trade competitiveness, are summarized by 4 indices: trade policy, infrastructure, economic environment, and sustainable development. The performance indicators are summarized by 3 indices: global export competitiveness, continental export competitiveness, and regional export competitiveness. Each of these indices is divided into several components, which bring together specific factors or indicators that conceptually belong together. To facilitate the comparison, we computed a score that indicates how well a country is doing in a particular area. How are these scores computed? Well, let's use the example of GDP per capita. For simplicity purposes, let's assume that a country has a GDP per capita of 3,000 USD. We will rescale this value into a score that ranges from 0 to 100. Here is how it works. For each indicator, the country in Africa with the lowest value in the period monitored by the observatory gets a score of 0. Conversely, the country in Africa with the highest value in the period monitored by the observatory gets a score of 100. Let's assume that the lowest value for GDP per capita is 1,300 USD and the highest value is 7,000 USD. The score for each West African country is then determined relative to its position between the minimum and the maximum. Our country of interest with a GDP per capita of 3,000 USD will get a score of 30. It is important to note that the higher the score, the better for the trade competitiveness. Indicators that are negatively correlated with trade competitiveness have been reversed, such as they can be interpreted as the higher being the better. Once the individual scores are computed, the indicators are aggregated together with a weighted average to obtain the score for each component. For instance, the score for the trade and investment policy component is calculated as the weighted average of tariff phase, number of RTA patterns by T partners, average trade preferences, and other indicators. These scores are then aggregated once more to obtain the scores for each index. In our example, the trade policy index is computed as a weighted average of the scores for trade and investment policy and trade facilitation. At each stage, equal weights are used as we consider that all indicators have the same importance for trade competitiveness. Regional scores for West Africa are then computed by aggregating the scores for each West African country. The same procedure is applied for computing the scores of other African regions or Africa as a whole. The module also presents trade indicators broken down by sector and subsector. We consider 9 sectors and 32 subsectors. In this case, the rescaling is done for every sector and subsector. This means that the score of 0 is assigned to the country in Africa, with the lowest value in a specific sector. Conversely, the score of 100 is assigned to the country in Africa, with the highest value in a specific sector. The score for each West African country is then computed relative to its position between the minimum and the maximum for all African countries. Are you curious to know more about the West African Competitiveness Observatory? In our next video, we will delve into the interpretation of the scores and charts of the Trade Competitiveness module.